Hi my friends, let's continue this extremely important course, and we are going to revise weak and strong adjectives. Let's have a look at all this. Big, huge or gigantic, hot, boiling, scared, terrified, bad, terrible, hungry, starving, tired, exhausted, happy, delighted, funny, hilarious, angry, furious, tasty, delicious, sad, miserable, small, tiny, interesting, fascinating, cold, freezing, clever, brilliant, good, fantastic, or great. Alright, let's continue. She was very scared of the thought of staying alone. Let's use strong adjectives in this lesson. She was very scared, or she was terrified. Terrified at the thought of staying alone. Right? As it was said, we can say terrified at or of. Terrified at the thought. Terrified. Terrified. She was terrified at the thought of staying alone. She was terrified at the thought of staying alone. The water looks very cold. The water looks freezing. Freezing. The water looks freezing. The water looks freezing. The water looks freezing. That's very good. Let's use the word great. That's great. That's great. 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 That's great. That's great. That's great. That's very funny. Very funny or hilarious. Hilarious. That's hilarious. That's hilarious. That's hilarious. That's hilarious. That's hilarious. She was terrified at the thought of staying alone. The water looks freezing. That's great. That's hilarious. This is a very big skyscraper. Let's use the word gigantic in this lesson. Huge or gigantic. Let's use gigantic. This is a gigantic skyscraper. Gigantic. This is a gigantic skyscraper. This is a gigantic skyscraper. She lives in a very small house. Small or tiny. Tiny. She lives in a very small or in a tiny house. Tiny. Tiny. She lives in a tiny house. She lives in a tiny house. It's really very cold now. Very cold or freezing. Freezing. It's really freezing now. It's really freezing now. Let's replace really with the word absolutely in this lesson to put an emphasis on it. It's really or it's absolutely freezing. It's absolutely freezing now. It's absolutely freezing now. It's absolutely freezing now. She looks really miserable. She looks really miserable. Or she looks absolutely miserable. Absolutely miserable. absolutely miserable. She looks absolutely miserable. She looks absolutely miserable. This is a gigantic skyscraper. She lives in a tiny house. It's absolutely freezing now. She looks absolutely miserable. I find this idea really fascinating. I find this idea absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I find this idea absolutely fascinating. I find this idea absolutely fascinating. It's a very clever idea. It's a very clever, or it's a brilliant idea. Brilliant, brilliant. It's a brilliant idea. It's a brilliant idea. It's a brilliant idea. He says that he's very hungry. When will we eat? He says that he's very hungry, or he says that he's starving. 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 When will we eat? He says that he's starving. When will we eat? He says that he's starving. When will we eat? He says that he's starving. When will we eat? The food is very good. Or the food is very tasty. Tasty. This word is more specific. The food is very tasty, or the food is delicious. 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 The food is delicious. The food is delicious. I find this idea absolutely fascinating. It's a brilliant idea. He says that he's starving. When will we eat? The food is delicious. I'm really very happy to be here. I'm really very happy, or I'm absolutely delighted. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Absolutely delighted. Absolutely delighted. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. He was really terrified. Or he was absolutely terrified. He was absolutely terrified. He was absolutely terrified. He was absolutely terrified. They were all very tired after the journey. They were all very tired or exhausted. They were all exhausted after the journey. Exhausted. Exhausted. They were all exhausted after the journey. They were all exhausted after the journey. They were all exhausted after the journey. The cake is really delicious. The cake is absolutely delicious. Absolutely delicious. Absolutely delicious. The cake is absolutely delicious. The cake is absolutely delicious. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. He was absolutely terrified. They were all exhausted after the journey. The cake is absolutely delicious. This is a very big building. This is a very big or a gigantic building. Gigantic. Gigantic. This is a gigantic building. This is a gigantic building. That's very good news. That's very good, or great, or fantastic. Fantastic. That's fantastic news. That's fantastic news. That's fantastic news. That's fantastic news. I was really exhausted at the end of the day. I was really exhausted, or I was absolutely exhausted at the end of the day. Absolutely exhausted. Absolutely exhausted. I was absolutely exhausted at the end of the day. I was absolutely exhausted at the end of the day. I'm really very happy to be with you. I'm really very happy, or I'm absolutely delighted to be with you. Absolutely delighted. Absolutely delighted. Absolutely delighted. I am absolutely delighted to be with you. I am absolutely delighted to be with you. I am absolutely delighted to be with you. This is a gigantic building. That's fantastic news. I was absolutely exhausted at the end of the day. I am absolutely delighted to be with you. The water is very hot. The water is very hot, or the water is boiling. Boiling. The water is boiling. The water is boiling. The water is boiling. That's very good news. That's very good, or that's great, or that's fantastic. Fantastic or great. For example, we can say that's great news. Great. Great. Great news. That's great news. That's great news. It was a very big mistake. It was a very big, or it was a terrible mistake. Terrible. It was a terrible mistake. A terrible mistake. It was a terrible mistake. It was a terrible mistake. He was really very angry. He was really very angry, or he was really furious. 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 He was really furious, or he was absolutely furious. He was absolutely furious. He was absolutely furious. For example, when he knew it. He was absolutely furious. He was absolutely furious. The water is boiling. That's great news. It was a terrible mistake. He was absolutely furious. That's really very good. That's really great, or that's really fantastic. Fantastic. Or that's absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic. That sounds really fascinating. That sounds really, or absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. That sounds absolutely fascinating. That sounds absolutely fascinating. That sounds absolutely fascinating. That's really hilarious. That's absolutely hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. That's absolutely hilarious. That's absolutely hilarious. She'll be very angry if she knows it. She'll be very angry, or she'll be furious. If she knows it. Furious. Furious. She'll be furious if she knows it. She'll be furious if she knows it. She'll be furious if she knows it. That's absolutely fantastic. That sounds absolutely fascinating. That's absolutely hilarious. She'll be furious if she knows it. My friends, thank you very much. We continue this extremely important course.